Boy feeds stray dog for weeks, until one day it brings something unexpected. Ethan broke the bread in half and offered the larger piece to the brown dog that waited for him every day in the same spot. The animal accepted the food gently, its brown eyes showing a gratitude the 9-year-old boy had never seen in any human around him. It was the 15th consecutive morning Ethan shared his breakfast with that stray. His grandmother Margaret was still asleep in the small room they shared at the back of Mrs. Wilson's house, where they paid rent with the elderly woman's pension money. Ethan always woke up before the other residents to have this special moment with his new friend. The boy had discovered the dog 3 weeks earlier, on his way home from school, when he saw the animal rummaging through the trash behind Mr. Johnson's bakery. It was skinny, with tangled fur and a small wound on its hind leg. Something in the creature's gaze touched Ethan's heart deeply. He had always felt a special connection with abandoned animals. Maybe it was because he himself often felt abandoned. His father had vanished when he was just 3, leaving behind empty promises and a mother who couldn't handle the responsibility. Catherine, his mother, had left Ethan with his grandmother when he turned 5, claiming she needed to work in another city. Her visits grew fewer until they stopped completely 2 years ago. The dog finished eating and moved closer to Ethan, nuzzling his small hand. The boy smiled and began petting the animal's fur, feeling a peace he rarely experienced at home. Mrs. Margaret, his 72-year-old grandmother, had a kind heart but was growing more forgetful. Some days she didn't recognize Ethan, calling him by the names of children who had long since passed. Other days she was lucid and told wonderful stories about the past, but those moments were becoming rarer. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the narrow alley where Ethan sat with the dog. It was Richard, Mrs. Wilson's youngest son, a 40-year-old man who had never held a job for long and saw Ethan as a nuisance on his property. "Yo, little brat, what are you doing with that disgusting mutt?" Richard yelled, his face red with anger. "How many times have I told you I don't want animals on my property?" Ethan quickly stood up, placing himself between Richard and the dog, which had retreated a few steps but hadn't run away completely. The boy knew he had to protect his friend. "He's not hurting anyone, Mr. Richard. He was just eating a little," Ethan replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite his fear. "I don't care. That thing could be sick, could bite someone. If I see it here again, I'm calling animal control. And you kids, stop feeding it. As if your senile grandma isn't trouble enough, now you want to bring pests here." Richard's words cut deep. Mrs. Margaret wasn't a pest. She was his grandmother, the only family he had left, and the dog wasn't a pest either. It was his only true friend. "My grandma isn't a pest," Ethan muttered, his fists clenched. Richard took 2 steps toward the boy, his expression growing even more threatening. "Say that again, you little brat. Your grandma doesn't even pay half of what she should to live here. If it weren't for my mother's pity, you'd have been thrown out long ago." Ethan swallowed hard. He knew Richard was right about the money. Mrs. Margaret's pension barely covered their basic needs, and Mrs. Wilson, Richard's mother, truly pitied their situation. But that didn't give the man the right to be so cruel. The dog approached again, as if sensing Ethan needed support. This infuriated Richard even more, and he picked up a stone from the ground. "Get out of here, you filthy mutt," he shouted, throwing the stone toward the animal. The stone grazed past the dog, who let out a small yelp of surprise but still didn't run away. This surprised both Ethan and Richard. Most stray dogs would immediately flee from a threat like that. "This mutt is crazy," Richard grumbled. "Listen, kid, last warning. If I catch you feeding that stray again, you'll both have to find somewhere else to live. Understood?" Ethan nodded, but inside, he was forming a plan. He wouldn't abandon his friend. He'd just have to be more careful. Richard walked away muttering curses, and Ethan waited until he was sure the man had gone into the main house. "Don't worry, buddy," he whispered to the dog, petting him again. "I'll keep taking care of you, but now it'll have to be somewhere." "Else?" The dog seemed to understand, resting his head against Ethan's leg in a gesture the boy took as gratitude. At that moment, an even deeper bond formed between them. Ethan spent the rest of the day thinking of a safe place where he could meet the dog. During class, Mrs. Rachel had to call his attention several times because he was distracted, staring. out the window and mentally planning his new routine. At recess, Ethan sat alone under a tree in the schoolyard, as he always did. He had never managed to form lasting friendships with his classmates. Some mocked him for wearing old patched clothes, while others simply ignored him. He had learned early on that it was easier to be alone than to face constant rejection. "Ethan, can I sit here?" asked a girl's voice. The boy looked up and saw Sophia, a classmate who rarely spoke to him. She was one of the few kids who had never joined in the cruel jokes the others made at his expense. "Sure," Ethan replied, somewhat surprised. Sophia sat beside him and stayed quiet for a moment before speaking again. "I saw you this morning. With that brown dog, is he yours?" Ethan grew alert. Was Sophia going to cause trouble for him and his friend? "No, he's not mine. Just a stray I sometimes run into," he answered cautiously. "He seems to really like you," Sophia observed. "My dad's a vet, you know. If you want, I can ask him to take a look at the little guy. He won't charge anything." The offer caught Ethan completely off guard. No one had ever offered to help him with anything, let alone something as important as his canine friend's health. "Why do you want to help?" Ethan asked, still suspicious. Sophia shrugged, playing with a leaf that had fallen from the tree. "I don't know. You seem like a good person. And I like animals. My dad always says people who care for strays have good hearts." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Ethan felt a strange emotion swelling in his chest. For the first time in a long while, someone had said something kind about him, and more than that, someone was offering real help. "The dog has a wound on his paw," Ethan said, deciding to trust Sophia. "It's getting better, but it hasn't fully healed. My dad can check it out. Where do you usually meet him?" Ethan hesitated. He couldn't meet the dog near home anymore because of Richard's threat. "But maybe you could take him to the school. Can you convince your father to come here after class?" asked Ethan. "I think so. He likes helping animals in need. I can talk to him tonight." The bell rang, signaling the end of recess, but Ethan remained seated for a few more seconds, processing that unexpected conversation. Maybe he wasn't as alone in the world as he'd thought. The rest of the school day passed more quickly. Ethan managed to pay attention to Mrs. Rachel's explanations because for the first time in weeks, he had something other than worries occupying his mind. He had hope. When school ended, Ethan rushed home, grabbed a piece of bread he'd saved from lunch and went out looking for his canine friend. He found him in the same alley where they always met, as if the dog knew Ethan would show up even after the morning's chaos. "Hi, buddy, I brought you some food," said Ethan, opening the small bag where he'd kept the bread. The dog approached, tail wagging, but Ethan noticed he was limping a little more than usual. The wound on his paw must have been bothering him. "Tomorrow you'll meet Sophia's father. He's a vet and will take care of your paw," Ethan explained, as if the dog could understand every word. Surprisingly, the animal stopped eating and looked straight into Ethan's eyes, as if he truly had understood. Then he did something completely unexpected. He let out a single quiet bark before running toward the back of the alley. Ethan was confused. His friend had never run off like that. He always stayed with him until it was time to leave. He decided to follow the dog to see where he was going. The dog stopped in front of a hole in the fence, separating Mrs. Wilson's property from an empty lot next door. Ethan had never noticed that hole before. The dog looked at him, barked again, and slipped through. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won out. He crawled through the hole and found himself in a lot overgrown with tall grass and a few trees. The dog stood near one of the trees, staring at something on the ground. When Ethan got closer, he saw something partially buried beneath the tree. It looked like red fabric, as if it were part of clothing. The dog began digging gently around the fabric, as if trying to show Ethan something. "What is this, buddy?" Ethan murmured. Kneeling beside the dog, carefully Ethan started helping dig. Soon he discovered the fabric was part of a red blouse, and there were more things buried with it. A small leather purse, some jewelry, and a notebook with a floral fabric cover. Ethan picked up the notebook with trembling hands. On the first page, written in neat handwriting, was, Diary of Hope Smith, 1987. His heart raced. Hope had been a young woman who disappeared in the area over 30 years ago, according to stories Mrs. Margaret sometimes told. The dog sat beside Ethan and rested his head against his arm, as if trying to comfort him. Ethan quickly flipped through a few pages and saw the last entry was dated March 15, 1987, just 3 days before Hope's disappearance. "How did you know this was here?" Ethan asked the dog, who simply looked at him with his intelligent brown eyes. Ethan carefully placed everything back in the purse and tucked it under his shirt. He wasn't sure what to do with this discovery, but he knew it was important. Maybe Mrs. Margaret knew more about Hope and could help him understand the meaning of these objects. When Ethan got home, he found his grandmother sitting on the small back porch, peeling potatoes for dinner. She seemed to be having one of her good days, her gaze clear and focused on the task. "Grandma, do you remember Hope Smith?" asked Ethan, sitting down beside her. Mrs. Wilson stopped peeling the potatoes and looked at Ethan with a strange expression, a mix of surprise and sadness. "Why are you asking about Hope, child? You always say she disappeared a long time. How I wanted to know more about her." The grandmother sighed deeply and set down the potato she was peeling. Hope was a very kind girl. She worked at the Thompson family's house nearby. She was engaged to Frank, a young man who worked at Mr. Johnson's workshop. They were supposed to get married in April 1987. Ethan listened carefully to every word, trying to connect the information with what he had found. What happened to her grandma? No one knows for sure. One day she went into town to buy her wedding dress and never came back. Frank searched for her for months. The Thompson family offered a reward, but they never found a trace of her. And Frank? What happened to him? Mrs. Wilson shook her head sadly. Poor boy. He was devastated, lost his mind for a while. Ended up moving away about 2 years later. No one ever heard from him again. His mother, Mrs. Constance, was heartbroken. She passed away not long after her son left. Ethan fell silent, processing the information. There was a sad story behind the things he had found, and somehow his dog friend had led him to them. "Why are you asking about this, my grandson?" Mrs. Wilson asked, gently touching Ethan's face. "Just curious, Grandma. You tell such interesting stories that sometimes I can't stop thinking about them." Mrs. Wilson smiled and went back to peeling the potatoes, but Ethan noticed she seemed more thoughtful than before. He decided not to mention his discovery yet. He needed to understand what it all meant. That night, Ethan barely slept. His mind raced with questions about the dog, about Hope, about how those items had ended up in that spot, and most of all, how the animal had known exactly where to look. The next morning, Ethan woke before sunrise, eager to find his friend. He packed more food than usual and hurried to the alley. The dog was already there, waiting for him as always. "Good morning, buddy," Ethan said, offering the food. "You're really smart, you know. How did you find those buried things?" The dog ate calmly, but Ethan noticed he seemed more restless than usual. After finishing the meal, the dog walked back toward the hole in the fence, looking at Ethan as if inviting him to follow. Ethan trailed the dog to the empty lot. This time the animal didn't stop near the tree where they had found Hope's belongings. He kept walking to a more secluded part of the lot, close to the back of another property. There, the dog began, sniffing the ground intensely, as if searching for something specific. Suddenly he stopped in front of a small mound of dirt that looked different from the rest of the terrain. A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. Could there be more things buried? There? He glanced around to make sure no one was watching and began digging carefully. It didn't take long for his hands to find something solid. It was a small metal box, rusted with time. Ethan carefully pulled it from the dirt and slowly opened it. Inside were several yellowed letters, all addressed to "My dear Hope," and signed, "By your loving Frank." There was also a small gold ring and a black and white photo of a young, smiling couple. Ethan examined the photo more closely. The girl had dark hair and a sweet smile, wearing the exact red blouse they had found the day before. The young man beside her was tall and thin, with kind eyes and a proud smile. "That must be Hope and Frank," Ethan murmured to the dog, who sat beside him and studied the photo intently. Ethan opened one of the letters and read a few lines. It was a passionate love letter where Frank spoke about the plans he had for their future, the house they were building together, and the children they wanted to have. The boy felt his eyes fill with tears. There was so much love in those words, so many dreams and hope. What could have happened to make it all end so sadly? Suddenly, the dog stood up and began to bark softly, looking toward the fence. Ethan quickly hid the box under his shirt and peeked in the direction the dog was pointing. Richard was walking through Mrs. Wilson's backyard, seemingly searching for something. Ethan crouched down in the tall grass, pulling the dog close. "Quiet. Buddy," he whispered. "No noise." The dog seemed to understand perfectly and stayed still beside Ethan, watching Richard through the brush. The man wandered the yard for a few minutes before going inside, apparently having noticed nothing unusual. Ethan waited a little longer before moving again. When he was sure it was safe, he stood up and walked back to the spot where they had found Hope's belongings. "You knew these things were here, didn't you?" Ethan said to the dog. "But how? You're too young to have known Hope." The dog just looked at him with intelligent eyes, and Ethan had the strange feeling that there was far more mystery surrounding his friend than he could imagine. At school, Ethan could barely focus on his lessons. His mind was full of questions about Hope, Frank, and especially how the dog had known where to find those objects. During recess, Sophia approached him again. "My dad might come by after school today to check on your friend," she said, sitting beside Ethan under the tree. "Thank you so much, Sophia. You have no idea how much this means to me." "Where are you meeting the dog? Does he come here to school?" Ethan thought quickly. He couldn't take Sophia and her father to the empty lot. They might discover the buried items. But he also couldn't meet the dog near home because of Richard's threat. "I think I can bring him here to the schoolyard," Ethan said. "He follows me whenever I ask." "Okay, my dad should be here around 4:30. Can you have the dog here by then?" "I'll make it happen. Thanks again, Sophia." Ethan spent the rest of the day figuring out how to convince the dog to come to school with him. He'd never tried taking him far from the alley where they usually met. When classes ended, Ethan rushed home, grabbed some food, and went to find his friend. As always, the dog was waiting in their usual spot. "Hey, buddy, today you're going to meet some people who will help take care of your paw," Ethan said, offering the food. Once the dog finished eating, Ethan started walking slowly toward the school, glancing back to see if the dog would follow. To his relief, the dog came along without hesitation. They walked together through the small town streets, Ethan quietly explaining where they were going and why. When they reached the school, Ethan saw a white car parked near the gate. Middle-aged man with graying hair and a white coat was talking to Sophia near the entrance. "Dad, this is Ethan I told you about," said Sophia when she saw them approaching. The man turned and smiled kindly at Ethan. He had a gentle face and eyes that exuded trust. "Hi, Ethan. I'm Dr. Paul, Sophia's father. She told me about you." "And your friend here," he said, pointing at the dog. Ethan felt a little shy in front of the vet, but the dog approached Dr. Paul fearlessly, as if somehow knowing the man was there to help. "What a beautiful little guy," the vet remarked, kneeling to examine the dog. "He looks well cared for. How long have you been feeding him?" "About 3 weeks," Ethan replied. Dr. Paul began carefully checking the dog, inspecting his eyes, ears, and teeth. When he reached the injured paw, the animal stayed still, letting the vet examine it in detail. "The wound is healing well, but it still needs some care," Dr. Paul explained. "I'll clean it better and apply some ointment. Can you put the medicine on twice a day?" Ethan nodded eagerly. He'd do anything to help his friend. As the vet tended to the dog's paw, Ethan noticed something odd. The animal looked unusually calm, as if familiar with this kind of treatment. Most strays got nervous when handled by strangers, but his friend seemed completely at ease. "He's been treated by a vet before," Dr. Paul observed, as if reading Ethan's thoughts. "There are signs he's had vaccines and professional care. He's not your average stray." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, surprised. "Well, judging by his teeth, coat, and behavior, I'd say this dog was well cared for by someone until recently. He probably got lost or was abandoned not long ago." Ethan looked at the dog with new eyes. If he'd been well cared for, it meant someone might be looking for him. The thought of having to part with his friend made his chest tighten. "Dr. Paul, if the dog has an owner, will I have to give him back?" Ethan asked, his voice wavering. The vet finished applying the ointment and gave the boy a kind look. "First, let's see if anyone's actually searching for him. I'll ask around the clinic if any clients lost a dog matching his description. If no one's looking, you can keep him." Ethan felt both relief and unease. He wanted his friend to stay with him, but he also knew it would be wrong to take him from a family that loved and cared for him. "Ethan, can I make a suggestion?" Dr. Paul said, putting away his tools. "Why don't you give him a name? It'll make it easier to call him and build a bond." Ethan looked at the dog, who watched him with intelligent brown eyes. What name would suit such a special animal? "How about Duke?" Sophia suggested. "He has a noble posture, like a little prince." Ethan smiled. The name really did fit his friend. "Duke," Ethan said, and the dog immediately turned his head as if recognizing it. "Do you like your new name, Duke?" The dog wagged his tail and gave a soft bark, as if approving the choice. Dr. Paul handed Ethan a tube of ointment and explained in detail how to apply it. He also gave some advice on food and general care. "If there's any trouble, you can find me at the clinic. And Ethan, you're doing a really good job looking after him. Not everyone has that kind of compassion for animals." The vet's words filled Ethan with pride and determination. He'd keep taking the best care of Duke no matter what, even if it meant facing Richard's threats and finding creative ways to keep the dog safe. After Dr. Paul and Sophia left, Ethan walked back to the alley with Duke. The dog seemed livelier, perhaps because his paw wasn't bothering him as much. "Duke, did you like Dr. Paul?" Ethan asked as they headed home. The dog wagged his tail, and Ethan took it as a positive answer. When they reached the alley, Duke did something unexpected. Instead of lying down in his usual resting spot, he walked straight to the hole in the fence and looked at Ethan, as if inviting him to the empty lot again. Ethan hesitated. It was already getting dark and Margaret would surely worry if he took too long getting home. But curiosity won out. "All right, Duke, but just for a few minutes." Ethan followed the dog into the lot. To his surprise, Duke didn't go to any of the spots where they'd found objects before. This time, he walked toward an area near the back of the Thompsons' property, where Hope had once worked. There, Duke began sniffing along the fence as if searching for something specific. Suddenly, the dog started digging at a spot where the dirt looked freshly disturbed. Ethan moved closer and saw something white half buried there. Carefully, he brushed away the dirt and uncovered a small porcelain statue of a saint, broken in half. "What's this, Duke?" Ethan murmured, examining the pieces. The dog sat beside him and stared intently at the broken statue. Ethan fitted the two pieces together. They matched perfectly. On the base, there was a small inscription: "To Hope with Love, Frank, 1986. Ethan's heart raced. This was another piece of the puzzle about Hope and Frank. Why were all these things buried in different places? And most importantly, how did Duke know where to look? Suddenly, Ethan heard voices coming from the Thompsons' property. Men's voices, speaking in hushed but agitated tones. He crouched in the bushes, pulling Duke close. "You sure no one's messed with the fence?" said a voice Ethan didn't recognize. "I'm sure, but I've got a feeling someone's been snooping around here," replied another voice, one Ethan recognized as Richard's. "If anyone finds out anything, we'll have trouble. You know that, right?" "I know, but it's been over 30 years. Who'd think there'd still be traces?" A chill ran down Ethan's spine. What were these men talking about? What traces? Could it be related to Hope's disappearance? "The problem is that kid who keeps playing with that mutt near the back. If he starts poking around the lot..." "What kid?" "Margaret's grandson, some brat with too much time on his hands. I've already warned him to stay away, but you know how kids are." Ethan swallowed hard. They were talking about him, and from the sound of it, something very dangerous was at stake. "You think he's seen anything?" "I don't know, but we'd better be careful. If needed, we'll find a way to send him and his grandmother far away from here." The voices began to fade and Ethan let out a relieved breath. But now he was terrified. What terrible secret were Richard and the other man hiding? And what would they do if they found out Ethan had already uncovered some of the buried things? Duke seemed to sense Ethan's fear. The dog pressed closer and rested his head against Ethan's chest, as if trying to comfort him. "Duke, I think we're mixed up in something really dangerous," Ethan whispered. "But I need to find out what happened to Hope, and you're going to help me, right?" The dog looked straight into Ethan's eyes and let out a single quiet bark, as if agreeing. Ethan carefully stored the broken pieces of the statue and headed home with Duke. His mind buzzed with questions and theories about what he had discovered. When he arrived, he found Mrs. Margaret preparing dinner in the small kitchen. She seemed to be having another one of her good days, humming softly as she stirred the pot. "Hi, Grandma. Sorry I'm late," said Ethan, kissing his grandmother's cheek. "It's all right, my boy. Where were you? You seem restless." Ethan hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, but he was afraid of worrying her or that she might not believe him. Mrs. Margaret had been growing more forgetful lately, sometimes confusing reality with distorted memories. "Grandma, do you remember if Hope had anything special? Some keepsake that Frank had given her?" Mrs. Margaret stopped stirring and grew thoughtful for a moment. Hope did have a few things from Frank, yes. A statue of St. Teresa that he brought back from a trip. An engagement ring he bought by working extra hours at the shop. Some love letters. And what happened to those things when she disappeared? No one knew. The Thompson family searched for all her belongings, but they were never found. It was just another mystery of her disappearance. Ethan's heart raced. The things he and Duke had found were exactly Hope's lost belongings, but how had they ended up buried in different places? And why did Duke know where to look? "Grandma, do you think Hope might not have disappeared by choice?" Mrs. Margaret looked at Ethan with a serious expression. "Why are you asking that, child?" "Just curiosity. Hope's story is so sad, and I keep wondering what might have happened to her." His grandmother sighed and went back to stirring the food. "My boy, there are things in this life best left untouched. The past sometimes hides secrets that can hurt those who uncover them." Mrs. Margaret's words left Ethan even more intrigued. Did his grandmother know something about Hope's disappearance that she had never shared? That night, Ethan barely slept again. His mind wouldn't stop working, trying to piece together the puzzle forming before him. Hope had disappeared over 30 years ago. Her belongings were buried in different spots on an empty lot. Richard seemed to know something about traces that needed to stay hidden, and Duke, in some mysterious way, knew exactly where to look. For all these things, Ethan also couldn't stop thinking about the conversation he had overheard between Richard and the stranger. They had mentioned they'd find a way to send Ethan and Mrs. Margaret away if necessary. That meant they were being watched and were in real danger. The next morning, Ethan woke up determined to uncover more about the mystery, but also careful not to get caught. He packed food for Duke and left the house early before Mrs. Margaret even woke up. He found Duke at their usual spot, but this time the dog seemed agitated. As soon as he saw Ethan, he began pacing in circles and barking softly, as if trying to communicate something urgent. "What is it, Duke?" Ethan asked, offering the food. The dog sniffed it, but didn't eat. Instead, he walked straight to the hole in the fence, looking back at Ethan as if it were a matter of extreme urgency. Ethan followed Duke to the empty lot. The dog went straight to an area they hadn't explored yet, near the back of the house where the Thompson family lived. There, Duke began digging frantically. "Easy, Duke. You'll hurt yourself," Ethan said, kneeling beside the dog. But Duke didn't stop digging. He seemed desperate to show Ethan something. In just a few minutes, his paws found something solid. Ethan helped dig, and soon they uncovered a small wooden box, more worn than the other objects they had found. When Ethan opened it, he discovered something that took his breath away. Inside the box was a red women's shoe, the kind worn in the 80s, and a wet, stained but still legible ID card. It belonged to Hope Smith, with a photo of the smiling young woman Ethan already recognized from their earlier discoveries. But what caught his attention most was a handwritten letter, its shaky and desperate script leaping off the page. Ethan read it with his heart pounding. "If anyone finds this, please look for me. My name is Hope Smith. I'm being held captive by someone I know and trust. I can't escape. Please help me. Frank, if you're reading this, I love you. And I'm so sorry for everything. Hope. Ethan's hands trembled as he held the letter. Hope hadn't disappeared willingly. She had been held captive by someone she knew and trusted. And for some reason, her belongings had been buried in different places, maybe to make it seem like she had really run away. Duke moved closer to Ethan and rested his head against the boy's arm, as if sensing his distress. Ethan looked at the dog with sudden understanding. "Duke, you're not just an ordinary dog, are you?" he whispered. "You know about these things for a special reason." The dog locked eyes with Ethan and did something that left the boy utterly stunned. Duke took a few steps toward the Thompsons' house, then turned back, repeating the motion several times, as if trying to show him a path. Ethan understood. Duke wanted to lead him to the Thompsons' house, but why? Was that where Hope had been held captive? "No, Duke, it's too dangerous," Ethan said. "Ethan, the Thompsons' place is too close to where Richard lives. If he sees her..." But Duke insisted, walking again toward the Thompsons' property and staring at Ethan with an almost human urgency. Ethan wavered between curiosity and fear. He knew approaching the Thompsons' house was risky, especially after the conversation he'd overheard the night before, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Duke was leading him to something important. "All right," he finally said. "But we have to be very careful." Ethan tucked the letter and the other items safely under some rocks and followed Duke toward the back of the Thompsons' property. The dog moved cautiously, stopping often to check for anyone nearby. When they reached the fence separating the empty lot from the Thompsons' land, Duke paused and sniffed intently near the base. There was a spot where the fence looked recently repaired, with newer planks standing out against the old weathered wood. Duke began digging near the fresh boards, and Ethan noticed the dirt there had also been disturbed recently. His heart raced. Could there be something else buried there? But before they could investigate further, Ethan heard footsteps approaching. Quickly, he pulled Duke behind a tree, signaling for the dog to stay quiet. Richard appeared, walking across the Thompsons' property with the same man he'd spoken to the night before. Now Ethan could see him clearly, a tall man with graying hair, the look of someone with money and authority. "Are you sure no one's been here?" the older man asked, pointing directly to where Duke had started digging. "Positive, Mr. Arthur," Richard replied. "But like I said yesterday, I've been worried about that kid who keeps snooping around." Mr. Arthur. Ethan recognized that name. Arthur Thompson was the patriarch of the Thompson family, the owner of the property where Hope had worked. A respected man in town, with thriving businesses and a good reputation. Could it be possible that he was involved in Hope's disappearance? "If that boy finds out anything, we'll both be in serious trouble," said Arthur, his voice thick with threat. "You know very well what happened here. If this comes out after all this time..." "I know, Mr. Arthur. But what can we do? The kid's just a child. Children talk too much, and that boy lives with an old woman who's already losing her mind. If he tells her anything, she might go around blabbing." Ethan felt a surge of anger, hearing Arthur speak about Mrs. Margaret in such a disrespectful way. His grandmother might forget things sometimes, but she didn't deserve to be treated like a problem. "What do you suggest we do?" asked Richard. "For now, we keep them away from here. If needed, we'll find a way to make them move far from town. You said they pay rent to your mother, right?" "They do. Not much, but they pay." "Then it's easy. Your mother can raise the rent to an amount they can't afford. Then they'll have to leave." Ethan swallowed hard. They were planning to force them out of town. And Mrs. Wilson, who had always been kind to him and Mrs. Margaret, would be convinced by Richard to go along with the plan. "What if that doesn't work?" Richard pressed. "Then we'll have to take more drastic measures," Arthur replied, his voice turning even colder. "Thelsa, you know I have connections who can handle this kind of problem discreetly." The veiled threat sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Arthur Thompson was clearly willing to do anything to keep his secret hidden, even if it meant putting Ethan and Mrs. Margaret in danger. The two men kept talking for a few more minutes, checking the spot where they'd fixed the fence and making sure everything was as it should be. Then they walked off toward the main house. Ethan waited several minutes before stepping out from behind the tree. His heart was still racing, and now he was certain he was caught up in something far bigger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Duke approached and nudged his hand with his snout, as if trying to comfort him. Ethan petted the dog and tried to gather his thoughts. "Duke, now I understand why you brought me here," Ethan said. "Arthur Thompson did something terrible to Hope, and somehow you know it. But how?" The dog just looked at him with those intelligent eyes, and Ethan once again had the feeling there was far more mystery to his friend than he could grasp. Ethan knew he had to tell someone about everything he'd discovered, but he didn't know who. Mrs. Margaret sometimes got confused and might not believe him or forget everything soon after. The local police probably wouldn't take a child's accusations against a respected man like Arthur Thompson seriously. And now he and Mrs. Margaret were in real danger. Arthur and Richard would do anything to drive them out of town, and if that didn't work, they'd take more drastic measures. "I need to find a way to prove what we found," Ethan told Duke. "But how?" The dog did something unexpected. He walked back to the spot where he'd started digging near the repaired fence and began scratching at the dirt with more urgency than before. Ethan understood. Duke wanted him to keep digging there. Something else was buried there, something important that could help prove the truth about what had happened to Hope. But digging there would be extremely dangerous. It was too close to the Thompsons' house, and if Arthur or Richard caught them, the consequences would be terrible. "Duke, I can't dig there right now, it's too risky," explained Ethan, "but I promise we'll come back when it's safer." The dog seemed frustrated, but accepted Ethan's decision. Together they returned to the spot where they had hidden the other objects they'd found. Ethan spent the next few minutes examining everything they had discovered again. Hope's diary, Frank's letters, the engagement ring, the broken statue, of St. Teresa, the red shoe, the ID, and the desperate letter pleading for help. Each item told a part of the story. Hope had been a passionate young woman, engaged to Frank, working for the Thompson family, and planning a happy future. But something had gone terribly wrong. She had been held captive by someone she trusted, and her belongings had been buried to make it seem like she had run away. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. Ethan looked at Duke, who watched intently as he handled the objects. "Duke, do you have some connection to Hope or Frank?" Ethan asked. "It's the only explanation for how you knew where to find all these things." As if answering the question, Duke stood up and walked to a nearby area Ethan hadn't noticed before. There was a small pile of stones arranged in a circle, nearly hidden by the vegetation. It looked very old. Ethan approached and began examining the stones. They didn't seem placed there by chance. There was a pattern, like some kind of marker. Beneath the stones, Ethan found something that left him speechless. It was a small old weathered dog collar. On the collar was a tiny metal tag with the name Rex engraved, and below it a date, 1957-1972. Ethan did the math quickly. Rex had lived for 15 years, until 1972. Hope had disappeared in 1987, 15 years later. Was it just a coincidence? But when Ethan looked back at Duke, the dog was standing right over the pile of stones, as if paying tribute to someone very special. An impossible idea began forming in Ethan's mind. Could Duke have some connection to Rex? Dogs didn't live that long, but... "Duke, did you know Rex?" Ethan asked, knowing the question was absurd, but still hoping for some kind of answer. Duke looked at Ethan, then at the old collar. Then he did something extraordinary. He gently picked up the collar with his mouth and brought it to Ethan, placing it in his hands. A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. There was something supernatural happening here, something that defied all logic. But at the same time, he felt he was finally beginning to understand the truth. Rex had been someone important's dog in Hope's story. Maybe Frank's, maybe even Hope's herself. And somehow, Duke had access to the memories or knowledge Rex had left behind. Ethan carefully stored the collar with the other items. He needed to get home before Mrs. Wilson woke up and worried about his absence. "Come on, Duke. I need to think about all this and decide what to do next." The dog followed him back to the alley, but Ethan noticed Duke seemed more restless than usual. He kept glancing back toward the empty lot, as if he knew there were still important things to uncover there. When Ethan got home, he found Mrs. Wilson still asleep. He hid the objects he'd found in an old box under his bed and tried to act normal, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. During breakfast, he watched his grandmother closely, looking for signs of one of her lucid days. I needed to ask her some important questions, but I wanted to make sure she'd be clear-headed enough to answer. "Grandma, how are you feeling today?" Ethan asked carefully. "Fine, my grandson. Why do you ask?" "Just wanted to be sure. Do you remember what we talked about yesterday regarding hope?" Mrs. Margaret stopped drinking her coffee and stared intently at Ethan. "Yes, I remember. Why are you so interested in that old story?" Ethan took a deep breath. This was his chance to uncover more information. "Grandma, did you know Frank personally?" "Of course I did. He was a very good young man, hard-working. He loved hope more than anything in this world." "Did he have a dog?" The question seemed to surprise Mrs. Margaret. "Yes, he did. A stray named Rex that he found on the street when he was a boy. That dog was Frank's passion. He was always by his side." Ethan felt his heart race. His suspicions were being confirmed. "What happened to Rex?" "Poor thing, he passed away a few years before Hope disappeared. Frank was inconsolable. He said Rex was like a brother to him." "Grandma, is there any chance that someone from the Thompson family could have hurt Hope?" Mrs. Margaret fell, silent for a long moment, her expression turning serious and worried. "Why are you asking this, Ethan?" "It's just, sometimes I hear strange conversations around town, people talking about old things that should have stayed buried." His grandmother got up from the table and walked to the window, looking toward the Thompson property. "My grandson, there are things in this life best left alone, especially when they involve powerful people who could harm us." "But Grandma, if someone hurt Hope, shouldn't the truth come out?" Mrs. Margaret returned to the table and took Ethan's hands. "Ethan, listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. There have always been rumors about what really happened to Hope. Some suspected she didn't disappear by choice, but no one could ever prove anything." "What kind of rumors?" "Rumors that she'd discovered something she shouldn't have about the Thompsons' business, that she'd seen or heard things that could harm important people." Ethan felt he was getting closer to the truth. "What kind of things, Grandma?" Mrs. Margaret hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might be listening. "Dirty dealings, my grandson. Money that came from places it shouldn't have. The Thompsons have always been very rich, but not always honestly. And Hope found out. That's what some always suspected, that she saw something she shouldn't have, and that's why—" Mrs. Margaret didn't finish the sentence, but Ethan understood perfectly what she was implying. "Grandma, why did no one ever investigate these suspicions?" "Because the Thompsons are too powerful, Ethan. They have money, influence, important connections. No one dares go against them without solid proof." Ethan fell silent, processing everything he'd learned. Now he had a clearer picture of what had happened. Hope had uncovered something damning about the Thompsons' business, likely something illegal. That's why Arthur Thompson had decided to silence her. "Grandma, if someone had proof about what happened to Hope, who should they take it to?" Mrs. Margaret looked at Ethan with alarm. "Ethan, please tell me you're not thinking of digging into this." "I'm just asking, Grandma. My grandson, listen well. If you found something or if someone told you anything about this, forget it immediately. Our family has suffered enough already. We can't afford to make powerful enemies." Note, the translation strictly follows the provided cultural mappings, maintains the original paragraph structure, and preserves the tone and style of the dialogue while ensuring natural flow in English. Ethan nodded, but inside he was more determined than ever to uncover the whole truth. Mrs. Wilson was right about the dangers involved, but he felt he owed it to Hope, to Frank, and especially to Duke, who for some mysterious reason was helping him discover the truth. "Grandma, just one more question. Do you remember if Frank ever looked for Hope in a specific place when she disappeared?" "He searched everywhere possible. He went to other towns, asked everyone who knew her. But there was one place he kept coming back to." "What place?" "The empty lot behind the Thompsons' property. He said he felt Hope was nearby. He'd spend hours digging through the dirt, looking for any sign of her. People thought he was losing his mind from grief." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. Frank had been so close to the truth, but he never found the evidence that was literally buried beneath his feet. What made Frank stop searching? Arthur Thompson talked to him, said Frank was disturbing the family with his constant searching, that it was time to accept Hope had chosen to leave. He even offered him money to move to another town and start over. And Frank took it? In the end, yes. He was crushed by grief and by people saying he was becoming obsessed. He took the money Arthur offered and left. No one ever heard from him again. Ethan now understood the cruel irony of the situation. Arthur Thompson had given Frank money not out of compassion, but to keep him away from the place where the truth about Hope's fate was hidden. "Grandma, thank you for telling me all this. I promise I'll be careful." Mrs. Wilson kissed Ethan's forehead. "You're a good boy, Ethan. Your heart's in the right place. But sometimes having your heart in the right place can get you into trouble. Promise me you'll think carefully before doing anything." "I promise, Grandma." Ethan spent the rest of the morning helping Mrs. Wilson with chores, but his mind kept circling back to the mystery he'd uncovered. He knew he had important information about a crime that had happened over 30 years ago, but he also knew proving it would be extremely difficult and dangerous. When it was time for school, Ethan said goodbye to his grandmother and hurried to the alley to meet Duke. The dog was there, as always, but seemed more anxious than usual. "Hey, Duke, I can't stay long before school, but I promise I'll come back later so we can talk." Ethan offered Duke food, but once again, the dog seemed more interested in showing him something than eating. This time, Duke walked to a part of the alley they'd never explored before and started sniffing near a pile of rubble. "Duke, we don't have time now. I have to get to school or I'll be late." But the dog insisted, whining softly and continuing to sniff around the debris. Ethan moved closer and saw something half hidden among the old wood and scrap metal. It was a small, damp-stained notebook, but still readable. He picked it up and saw written on the cover, "Frank Sullivan, 1987. His heart raced. Another journal, this time Frank's. Ethan quickly flipped through a few pages and saw notes about Frank's search for Hope. There were hand-drawn maps of places he'd checked, lists of people he'd spoken to, and most importantly, his suspicions about what had really happened. On one page, Frank had written, "I'm sure Arthur Thompson knows more than he's saying. His behavior changed after Hope disappeared. He used to be friendly with me. Now he barely looks me in the face. And why is he in such a hurry to convince me to leave town?" Ethan wanted to read the entire diary, but he was really late for school. He tucked the notebook under his shirt and ran, promising Duke he'd return right after class. All day at school, Ethan could hardly concentrate. His mind was full of all the discoveries he'd made, and now he had another important piece of the puzzle, Frank's own suspicions about Arthur Thompson. During recess, Sophia approached him again. "Ethan, are you okay? You seem worried about something." "I'm fine, just a little tired," Ethan lied. "My dad asked about your dog. He said if you want, you can bring him to the clinic for a free checkup." "Thank you so much, Sophia. Your dad is very kind. He likes to help, and I like talking to you. You're different from the other boys our age." Ethan looked at Sophia curiously. It was rare for anyone to say something nice about him. Different how? More mature, more thoughtful, like you know things we don't. If she knew what Ethan really knew, she'd be shocked. But he couldn't share his secret with anyone, especially not a classmate. "Thanks," Ethan said simply. "Ethan, can I ask you something? You live just with your grandma, right?" "Yeah." "What about your parents?" Ethan hesitated. It was a question that bothered him, but Sophia had been kind to him, so she deserved an honest answer. "My dad left when I was little. My mom left a few years ago too. Said she had to work in another city." "I'm so sorry," Sophia said, her voice full of compassion. "That must be hard." "Sometimes it is, but my grandma takes good care of me. If you ever need someone to talk to, you can count on me. I promise. I can keep secrets." Sophia's offer touched Ethan deeply. For the first time in a long while, he felt less alone in the world. Maybe if things got too dangerous, he could tell her about his discoveries. When school ended, Ethan rushed back home. He found Mrs. Wilson dozing in the living room chair and took the chance to read Frank's diary more carefully. Frank's notes were even more revealing than Ethan had expected. Frank didn't just suspect Arthur Thompson, he'd found some concrete clues. April 15th, 1987. I talked to John, who works at the records office. He told me the Thompson family has several businesses registered with odd dates, always right after important people visit the property. It looks like they're laundering money somehow. April 20th, 1987. Hope had told me weeks before she disappeared that she'd seen strange men on the Thompson property late at night, carrying heavy boxes. Arthur told her they were just suppliers, but she got suspicious because they always came when no one else was around. April 25th, 1987. I found one of Hope's jewels buried near the empty lot. How did it get there? Hope never went to that place. Someone buried it on purpose, but why? Ethan's heart raced. Frank had found one of Hope's jewels in the same spot where Ethan and Duke had discovered the other items. This confirmed there was a direct connection between the empty lot and Hope's disappearance. The last diary entry was the most disturbing. April 30th, 1987. Arthur offered me money to leave town, said it would be better for me to start fresh somewhere else, far from sad memories. But I know he wants me gone for another reason. He's afraid of what I might find out. I'll take the money, but first I'm going to hide this diary somewhere where someone can find it in the future. If anything happens to me, at least the truth might come out someday. Ethan closed the diary with trembling hands. Frank had solid suspicions about Arthur Thompson and had hidden the diary on purpose so someone could uncover the truth later. And Duke, in a mysterious way, had led Ethan straight to the spot where the diary was hidden. Now Ethan had concrete proof that Arthur Thompson was involved in Hope's disappearance, but he still needed to find out exactly what had happened to her and where she was now. Ethan tucked the diary away with the other items and went out to find Duke. The dog was waiting in the alley but seemed even more restless than that morning. "Duke, I found Frank's diary. Now we know he suspected Arthur Thompson too," Ethan said, petting the dog. Duke immediately stood up and trotted toward the empty lot, looking back at Ethan urgently. It was as if he knew there was still something important to uncover. "You want to go back there, don't you?" Ethan said. "All right, but we have to be very careful." Ethan followed Duke to the empty lot. This time, the dog went straight to the spot near the repaired fence where they'd been interrupted the day before. Duke started digging again, even more determined than before. Ethan glanced around to make sure no one was watching and began helping Duke dig. The dirt here was looser than in other spots, as if it had been disturbed recently. Within minutes, they uncovered something that made Ethan recoil in shock. It wasn't personal items like the others they'd found. It was a piece of fabric that looked like part of a dress, and with it something Ethan didn't even want to think about. "Duke, I think we found Hope," Ethan whispered, feeling sick. The dog stopped digging and sat beside him, resting his head against Ethan's leg as if trying to comfort him. It was a terrible, solemn moment, and both seemed to understand the gravity of what they'd uncovered. Ethan covered the hole again with dirt, but marked the spot with a few stones so he could find it later. Now he was absolutely certain Arthur Thompson had done something horrible to Hope, and had buried traces of his crime in different places around the empty lot. "Duke, now I have to decide what to do with all this," Ethan said, his hands still shaking. "If I tell someone, they'll want to come here and check. But if Arthur Thompson finds out we know the truth..." The dog looked straight into Ethan's eyes, and the boy felt as if Duke was trying to give him courage and determination. "You're right. Hope deserves the truth to come out, and Frank deserves to know what really happened to her." Ethan spent the rest of the afternoon trying to form a plan. He knew he needed an adult's help, but he also knew the wrong person could put him and Mrs. Wilson in mortal danger. When he got home, he found Mrs. Wilson making dinner. She seemed to be having another one of her clear-minded days, which gave Ethan an idea. "Grandma, if someone found out where Hope is, who should they tell?" Mrs. Wilson stopped cooking and looked seriously at Ethan. "Ethan, did you find something about Hope?" Ethan hesitated, but decided it was time to tell his grandmother the truth. "Grandma, I need to tell you something very important, but promise you'll listen to the end without interrupting?" Mrs. Wilson sat at the table and motioned for Ethan to continue. Ethan told her everything. About Duke, about the buried objects, about Frank's diary, about the conversation he had overheard between Arthur Thompson and Richard, and finally, about what they had discovered that afternoon near the fence. When he finished recounting, Mrs. Wilson fell silent for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly. "Dear Lord," she murmured finally. "Ethan, are you sure about all this?" "Yes, Grandma. I can show you the things we found." Ethan brought out the box where he had stored all their discoveries. Mrs. Wilson examined each item carefully, her tears falling silently as she saw the evidence of Hope's tragic fate. "This really is the statue Frank gave her," said Mrs. Wilson, holding the pieces of St. Teresa. "And this is the engagement ring. I was there when he proposed to her." "Grandma, what should we do now?" Mrs. Wilson grew thoughtful for a few minutes. "Ethan, this is very dangerous. If Arthur Thompson finds out we know the truth, he might do something terrible to us too." "I know, Grandma, but I can't just pretend we didn't find anything. Hope deserves justice." "You're right, my grandson. But we need to be very careful about how we handle this. Do you know anyone we can trust? Someone with the authority to investigate, but who isn't influenced by the Thompsons' power?" Mrs. Wilson thought for a moment. "There's one person who might help. Sheriff Smith from the neighboring town. He's Hope's nephew. He always believed something bad had happened to her, but never had proof to investigate." Ethan felt a surge of hope. If they could speak to Sheriff Smith, maybe they could move forward without putting themselves in mortal danger. "How can we reach him, Grandma?" "I'll call him tomorrow. We'll say we found some things that might be important to Hope's case. But Ethan, you have to understand that once we tell him, there's no turning back. Things will be out of our control." "I understand, Grandma, but it's the right thing to do." That night, Ethan barely slept again. He knew that the next day, his life would change completely. Once Mrs. Wilson told Sheriff Smith about their discoveries, an investigation would begin, and Arthur Thompson would find out his secret had been exposed. Ethan also thought about Duke and the mysterious role the dog had played in this whole story. There was something supernatural about how the animal knew exactly where to look for evidence. It was as if Duke were guided by some force beyond human understanding. The next morning, Ethan woke early and went to find Duke. The dog seemed calmer than in previous days, as if he knew his mission was nearly complete. "Duke, today my grandmother is going to tell Sheriff Smith everything. You helped me uncover the truth about Hope. I don't know how to thank you." The dog moved closer to Ethan and rested his head against his chest in what seemed like a farewell gesture. "You're not leaving, are you?" Ethan asked, suddenly, worried. "I need you here with me." But Duke just looked at him with those knowing eyes and then walked toward the empty lot, as if there was still something important to show. Ethan followed the dog to the spot where they had found Rex's collar. There, Duke lay down on the pile of stones and went completely still, as if resting after a long journey. "Duke?" Ethan called, approaching cautiously. The dog was breathing, but seemed to be in a near trance state. Ethan sat beside him and began stroking his fur, feeling a strange sense that something important was happening. Suddenly, images began flashing in Ethan's mind like memories that weren't his own. He saw a brown dog running across the empty lot, saw young Frank desperately searching for Hope, saw Arthur Thompson burying objects in the dead of night. The images grew sharper. Ethan saw Hope being taken to a small shed at the back of the Thompson property, saw her trying to escape, saw Arthur Thompson growing increasingly desperate to keep his secret, and then Ethan saw the final scene. Hope had managed to write the letter asking for help and had thrown some of her belongings out the shed window, hoping someone would find them. But Arthur Thompson had discovered her attempt to leave clues and had made a terrible decision. The images stopped abruptly, and Ethan found himself back in the empty lot, petting Duke. The dog had opened his eyes and was looking at him with a peaceful expression. "Duke, you showed me what happened, didn't you?" Ethan whispered. "You're Rex's spirit, aren't you? You came back to help uncover the truth about Hope." The dog slowly stood up and licked Ethan's face once. Then he began walking toward the alley, as if he knew it was time to return to normal life. Ethan followed Duke, still processing the visions he'd seen. Now he fully understood what had happened to Hope and knew the evidence he'd found was enough to bring justice. When he got home, he found Margaret on the phone. From the look on her face, Ethan could tell she was talking to Sheriff Smith. "Yes, Sheriff. My grandson found some things that might be very important. No, I can't discuss it over the phone. I understand. This afternoon is fine. Thank you." Margaret hung up and turned to Ethan. "Sheriff Smith is coming here at 3 o'clock. He said he always suspected something was off about Hope's disappearance, but never had enough to open an official investigation. What's going to happen when he sees the evidence, Grandma?" "He'll start an official investigation, and then we'll see if Arthur Thompson is really as powerful as he thinks he is." Ethan spent the morning on edge, constantly checking to make sure all the items were safely stored. He also went out several times to find Duke, as if the dog's presence calmed him. At exactly 3 o'clock, a plain car pulled up in front of Mrs. Wilson's house. A middle-aged man, in simple clothes with a serious demeanor, stepped out and walked to the small back house where Ethan and Margaret lived. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Margaret," the man said, tipping his hat. "I'm Sheriff Smith." "Good afternoon, Sheriff. This is my grandson, Ethan, the one I mentioned on the phone." The sheriff greeted Ethan and sat in the small living room. He had kind but determined eyes, and Ethan immediately felt he could trust him. "Well, Mrs. Margaret, on the phone you mentioned you'd found something about my Aunt Hope. Can you tell me what you discovered?" Ethan and Margaret took turns telling the whole story. Ethan showed each item he'd found, explained how Duke had led him to the buried objects, and recounted the conversation he'd overheard between Arthur Thompson and Richard. Sheriff Smith listened in silence, carefully examining each piece of evidence. His hands trembled slightly as he held the letter where Hope had begged for help. "My God," he murmured at last. "Hope really tried to leave clues about what was happening to her." "Sheriff, do you believe us?" Ethan asked. "I do, son. This evidence is too solid to be made up. And besides, I've always had my suspicions. About Arthur Thompson. He completely changed after Hope disappeared." "What happens now?" Margaret asked. "I'll obtain a search warrant for the empty lot and the Thompson property. If we find what you've indicated, Arthur Thompson will be arrested for a very serious crime." "Sheriff, are we in danger?" asked Ethan, voicing the fear he'd felt for days. "You might be, but from now on I'll make sure you're protected. I'll leave trusted officers watching this property." Sheriff Smith took all the evidence Ethan had found and promised to return the next day with the search warrant. "One last thing," he said before leaving. "Can you show me exactly where you found each item? I'll need that information for the official search." Ethan agreed to accompany the sheriff to the empty lot the next day, though he was nervous about going back, knowing Arthur Thompson was desperate to keep his secret hidden. That night, Ethan went to see Duke one last time before the big search the following day. The dog was in the alley, but he looked different, more translucent, as if he were beginning to fade. "Duke, you're going to leave after all this is over, aren't you?" Ethan asked, tears in his eyes. The dog approached and rested his head against Ethan's hand. The boy felt a sense of peace and wholeness radiating from the animal. "Thank you for helping me uncover the truth. Thank you for being my friend when I needed it most." Duke licked Ethan's hand one last time and then slowly walked away, heading toward the empty lot. Ethan followed at a distance and watched as the dog lay down once more on the pile of stones where Rex's collar was buried. There, Duke closed his eyes and gradually began to fade until only a feeling of peace remained in the spot. Rex could finally rest, knowing he had helped bring justice for Hope. Ethan stayed for a few minutes, paying silent tribute to the two dogs who had changed his life. Then he returned home, knowing everything would be different the next day. The following morning, Ethan woke to the sound of several cars arriving at the property. Through the window, he saw Sheriff Smith accompanied by other officers and what appeared to be forensic experts. "Ethan, it's time," said Margaret, placing a hand on her grandson's shoulder. Ethan accompanied the sheriff and his team to the empty lot. With his heart pounding, he pointed out each location where he had found objects with Duke. The experts began working meticulously, documenting and collecting evidence. When they reached the spot near the fence where Ethan had indicated Hope's body was buried, The excavation confirmed their worst suspicions. "Sheriff, we've found human remains," one of the experts announced. Sheriff Smith closed his eyes for a moment, fighting back emotion. Then he turned to Ethan. "Thank you, son. Without your courage, my aunt would never have gotten justice." As the experts continued their work on the empty lot, other officers headed to the Thompson property with search warrants. Ethan and Margaret watched from a distance as Arthur Thompson was led out of his house in handcuffs. The man who had once been respected in town was now exposed as the one responsible for the disappearance and murder of an innocent young woman over 30 years ago. Richard was also arrested as an accomplice for helping cover up the crime all those years. Mrs. Wilson, his mother, was shocked to learn her son had been involved in something so terrible. "Ethan, Margaret," Mrs. Wilson said, approaching. Then with tears in her eyes, "I'm so sorry, I never imagined my son. You can stay here as long as you want. I won't charge rent anymore." The story spread quickly through town. Many people who had always suspected something strange about Hope's disappearance finally felt validated, and the community came together to support Ethan and Mrs. Margaret, recognizing the courage they had shown. Days later, Sheriff Smith returned with more news. "Ethan, we managed to locate Frank Sullivan. He lives in another town but is very eager to talk to you. He said he wants to thank you in person for uncovering the truth about Hope." The meeting with Frank was emotional. The man, now in his 50s, cried upon learning that his suspicions about Arthur Thompson had been correct and that Hope would finally receive the justice she deserved. "Ethan, you did something I couldn't do 30 years ago," Frank said, holding the boy's hands. "You brought peace to Hope's soul and to my heart as well." Frank decided to move back to town to be close to Hope's grave, which would finally receive a proper burial. He also offered to help Ethan and Mrs. Margaret financially as a gesture of gratitude. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story, but the story didn't end there. A few days after Arthur Thompson's arrest, Ethan was walking through the alley where he used to meet Duke when he saw something that left him speechless. A puppy, brown like Duke but much smaller, was sitting exactly where his friend used to. Wait for him. The puppy looked at him with the same intelligent eyes Ethan had grown to love. "Duke," Ethan whispered, slowly approaching. The puppy wagged its tail and ran toward Ethan, eagerly licking his hands. It was as if Rex Duke's spirit had returned in a new form, once again offering friendship and companionship to the boy who had helped bring justice. Ethan picked up the puppy and felt his heart fill with joy. He had lost one friend, but gained another, and this time he wouldn't have to hide or be afraid. He could openly care for his new companion. "Welcome back, friend," Ethan said, petting the puppy. "This time, you'll have a real home." Ethan named the puppy Hope in honor of the woman he had helped bring justice to. And just as Duke had brought unexpected revelations into his life, Hope would bring joy and unconditional love. Mrs. Margaret was delighted with the new family member, and curiously her episodes of forgetfulness decreased significantly after the whole truth came out. It was as if carrying the weight of that secret for so many years had affected her mind, and now that justice had been served, she could finally rest in peace. Ethan returned to school with newfound confidence. The story of his bravery had spread, and now he was seen with respect and admiration by his classmates. Sophia became his best friend, and together they cared for Hope, who became the school's unofficial mascot. Dr. Paul, the veterinarian, continued caring for Hope free of charge and became a father figure to Ethan. He even taught the boy basic veterinary care, planting a seed that might one day grow into a career. Frank kept his promise to help Ethan and Mrs. Margaret. He had a thriving business in the town where he'd lived and decided to open a branch in his hometown. He offered Mrs. Margaret a job as a receptionist, a light duty she could handle on her good days. With the extra income, Ethan and Mrs. Margaret were able to move into their own home, small but comfortable, with a backyard where Hope could play freely. The community never forgot Ethan's courage. Every year on the anniversary of Hope Smith's birthday, the town held a ceremony in her memory, and Ethan was always invited to speak about the importance of doing what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. Ethan grew up knowing he had made a difference in the world. He had brought justice for an innocent victim, peace to a grieving family, and had proven that even a child can stand up to injustice when they have courage and determination. And every night before bed, Ethan would gently stroke Hope's fur, and silently thank Duke, the mysterious dog who had appeared in his life just when he needed a friend and a purpose. The story of Ethan and Duke became a legend in town, passed down from generation to generation as an example of how kindness and bravery can overcome even the darkest secrets of the past. And so, a lonely boy who fed a stray dog became the hero, who brought justice to a 30-year-old tragedy, proving that sometimes the most important discoveries come through the purest hearts and the most unexpected friendships. Years later, when Ethan had grown into a young man, he often returned to the lot where it had all begun. Now it was a public park, built in memory of Hope Smith. At the center of the park stood a statue of a young woman holding a child's hand, and beside them, a loyal dog. The plaque on the statue read, "In memory of Hope Smith, and in honor of all who have the courage to seek the truth." Ethan always brought Hope to walk in the park, and the dog would run straight to the statue and sit at its feet, as if paying tribute. It was a moment of peace and reflection, reminding everyone that justice, though it may sometimes take time, always finds a way. And on special nights, when the moon was full and the wind whispered softly through the trees, Ethan swore he could see the shadow of Duke running through the park, free and happy, knowing his mission had been fulfilled. The end of the story. Now tell us what you thought of Ethan's journey with his special friend Duke. Do you believe there are mysteries of the past still waiting to be uncovered? Share your own experiences with special animals who came into your life in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories.